All right, my AP literature friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And up my sleeve in this one, I got a writing workshop featuring FRQ 3 from the 2024 exam, set 2, the lacking prompt. And what I'm going to do in this is show you student exemplars in which they wield what I call frames. Technically, they're known as heuristics. And in terms of the first frame, we use something known as the inverted thesis heuristic to anchor our thesis, and then body paragraphs are done with something known as the syllogistic method. So without further ado, let's jump in, but please subscribe to the channel. Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. Spread the word far and wide. Tell friends, colleagues, students so that I can beat that pesky rhythm and get my message out there as far and wide as possible. Here's the prompt. The key word that we have to focus on is lacking. And then in the second sentence, they give us this umbrella concept and a further definition of what they mean by lacking. So let's unpack it together. Many works of literature explore a character's sense of lacking something important in life. It's pretty simple. The character perceives an unfulfilled need, which may be, and then they enumerate it here, emotional, spiritual, financial, or something the character does not understand or cannot articulate. So it's pretty broad. Either from your own reading or from the following list, choose a work of fiction in which such a feeling is explored. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze how the character's sense of an unfulfilled need contributes to an interpretation of the work as a whole. Do not merely summarize the plot. So this was one of the easier FRQ3 prompts that I've seen in a number of years. So as long as students are focusing on that hole, that emptiness, that sense of lacking in a character in one particular work, they're good to go. So in order to get my students to write at the caliber that you're going to see, I do something known as Bob Rossing my instruction. So just like Bob Ross gets to the canvas and easel and paints with and for his students, I do the same, and I air quote paint. I write exemplars. And Bob Ross used heuristics, and it's known, his technique is known as the wet on wet technique. And I've already alluded to this. For our introductory paragraph, we're going to invert the thesis, and the body paragraphs, they're going to do syllogistically. So at the time of writing these exemplars, my students have had me for 7 months throughout the academic year. So the training wheels are off. They're very comfortable with these particular frames and heuristics and can wield them at ease. So here's the kicker, all right? Something to unlock all 3 FRQs, a little top secret code. For all 3, FRQ1, FRQ2, FRQ3, my students invert the thesis. And I'll briefly show you that a little bit in a second here. But if you want to do a deeper dive, I have videos in the YouTube channel for FRQ1 and FRQ2, and a lot of side projects where we do poetry and prose, which is basically the same thing for FRQ1 and FRQ2. That same frame, that same heuristic can be used for FRQ3, and then all body paragraphs are done syllogistically. So I'm blessed in the sense that I get my students in 10 honors, which is our pre-AP, and I introduce them to these frames. They follow me to AP Lang, and then they follow me to AP Lit. So they're pretty expert once they get to Lit. So here's what the inverted thesis heuristic looks like for FRQ1 and FRQ2. We use this for the introductory paragraph. So implicit in all the prompts, and if you go back to the 1970s, you can see this. So every single one over a 40-year span, they're asking 2 questions. What is the author's intent, and how does the author construct meaning? So we do something called 3+1 for a total of 4 sentences. The student is going to bust out 3 sentences addressing the first question, what is the author's intent? And then the last sentence constitutes and comprises the thesis statement. Whenever you get to the construction of meaning, that equates to the thesis. From there, you want to sprinkle in some tier 2 level vocab, which is just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. I run something called a word study academy in my classrooms. And it's just a real clever technique of strategies to help students augment their vocab. And then those that are familiar with my work know that I run a Nuance Academy, and a staple text of that Nuance Academy is Strunk and White's Write It Right, in which they have rule number 18 that espouses the concept that there's 12 sentence types and 20 sentence patterns. So in the examples, note how my students manipulate their syntax in order to get voice rhythm and flow. So here's what the inverted thesis heuristic looks like for our purposes. Again, we're going 3 plus 1, but it changes a little bit. So 3 sentences are going to comprise kind of like a universal truth around the key diction. So we have to have 3 sentences, riff 3 sentences about lacking as it pertains to our character in our particular choice of work. And then the last sentence, we're going to name the text and anchor it in the language of the key diction. Same old stuff, tier 2 sentence constructs. So here's the first one. And in red there, my student highlighted the key term lacking. Using it 3 times, I realize might be overkill, but just get a sense of what we're doing here. I'll read it top to bottom and then I'll unpack it. So look for that 3 plus 1. As is sometimes the case, one can starve from a lack of self-realization as much as they can from a lack of bread. And in such instances, the hunger to discover the true essence of one's being can yield an insatiable appetite that drives one to great lengths. Whether it be what appears to be an insurmountable obstacle or a deficit of spirit, once that sense of lacking is recognized, truly driven individuals set into motion a plan to pacify that internal gnawing. This is especially true of Edna Pontillier in Kate Chopin's The Awakening. So that last sentence is kind of a staple of the inverted thesis. You name your text. And you can see in the first 3 sentences, this student just kind of runs a mile or so around the concept of lacking and how it pertains to Edna Pontillier, taking one of the key umbrella concepts and riffing with that for a total of 3 sentences. You can see the vocab is up without overdoing it. You want to disabuse your students of the concept that if they use $1 million words, that somehow they're doing fantastic writing. And then each sentence is different. I always tell my students, repetition is the bane of the writer's existence. So sentence 2 is different than 1, 1 is different than 2, 3 is different than 2, 4 is different than 3. You don't want to parallel your syntax, otherwise you're going to yield that ... tone, which typically happens with young, emerging, struggling writers that overuse independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences. So let's paint one more. Right. Usually when I'm at the easel and, at my canvas, I model it 3 times, and I'll do that for you, but we're going to take a look at student samples. So again, in red, you can see the key word lack. So we're going to have 3 sentences hunkering in around that concept of lacking. Then the last sentence is going to name the text. While philosophers have grappled with the meaning of life ever since the far reaches of antiquity, there's one thing that most agree upon. The unexamined life is not worth living. Unfortunately, many individuals proceed throughout their lives in a blind stupor, never arriving at a sense of the complex inner machinations that comprise the true tick of one's clockwork. This lack of self-knowledge not only spells one's folly, but often their destiny to doom. All right, so we're 3 sentences in. Lots of talk of lack up there as it pertains to Gregor Samsa and Kafka, and we're going to name him and the book in the last sentence. Such is the case with Gregor Samsa in Kafka's classic tale of the Metamorphosis. So we'll do it one more time here, inverted thesis heuristic, or you can call it a frame if you want to. Same old concept. One thing leads to a sense of spiritual lacking, an eye that does not cast a thorough glance upon the pleading soul. So this one's going to do with spiritual lacking. Perhaps the folly of the human condition, most look outward to find the answers to the questions that drive one mad. But the irony is this. The solution to quench the thirst of the soul is through the arduous process of turning the gaze inward. With eyes that only look to the outside world, one can never find what they so desperately seek. In the case of Santiago and Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, this is especially true. So you can see here really nice sentence constructs. This kid even used a colon and a dash, which when I've read exams in the past, students typically do not do those types of things. And that's just stuff that we teach in the Nuance Academy. And then vocab is nice. I really like words like folly and arduous. It fits the kid's mouth perfectly. They're not gooning out. They don't sound pretentious or contrived. They own all of those words. And even at sentence level, you can see that there's no parallelism going on in here. So repetition is the bane of the author's, the writer's existence, even at sentence level. So the next question becomes, so how do I write the body paragraphs? We're going to do a total of 4 paragraphs, intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. I'll show you how to do the remainder of this. And before I do, let's talk about that heuristic for the body paragraphs. It comes from Aristotle. It's known as the syllogistic method. So he ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd often toss out these juicy, pithy, essential questions. And one such one is, what is justice? Which, if you've read Plato's Republic, you know that's the basis of the whole book. So what he noticed was students that had good, tight lines of reasoning argued mathematically. And in this case, he gave them a formula or a frame that went premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. So premise 1, if I were to say arsenic is deadly, and then I would follow it up with a little bit of textual support and say, went out into the kitchen this morning to make a cup of coffee, and there's my dog Skipper beneath the sink. And I say, hey, Skipper. And he pulls out his head, and all over his muzzle and his grizzle, he's got white stuff. And I'm like, I put arsenic under there because we have a rat infestation problem. You're going to naturally, cogently conclude your dog's going to die, Kristian. And as morbid as an example as that is, that's an example of a line of reasoning. For the purposes of writing an FRQ 3, this is what that heuristic is going to look like. Premise 1 is going to be an argument anchored in the key diction of the prompt. And there's some math that I have that goes along with this, that corresponds with this. I want that first premise to always be 3 sentences long, and that's true for all 6 FRQs, Lang and Lit. Here's the reason why. On FRQ 1 for AP language, the directions state a couple of times, your argument must be central. And students need to keep in mind that this is an expository essay, which by definition is an argumentative essay, okay? So if they get up into their source too early in the body paragraph, they're performing plot analysis, not literary analysis. So if they take 3 sentences, it should preclude them from doing that. So premise 1 is just an argument anchored in the key diction of the prompt. Premise 2 is the textual support. Here's where we get into all the lacking of any of those characters that we mentioned in the introductory paragraphs. And we got to crank the specificity. I want to detail scenes. I want to make connections, draw parallels and corollaries between specific events in the book. And then we also need to keep in mind that body paragraphs need conclusion. So this is where we're going to link back to the prompt and link back to the thesis. One little last piece of math, this takes 10 to 12 sentences to do. So those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that kids write on this particular FRQ, they don't hack it. There's not enough support and analysis in there. So you might ask, what's a first premise look like? I got you covered. Here's the whole thing. And you can see in here, you still got to stay anchored in lack. I have it highlighted in red. Patriarchal societies understandably stifle the true development of women, whether it be expressions of one's authentic self or even the attainment of spiritual fulfillment. Androcentric environments typically leave the opposite sex in a condition of desperate lack. As is often the case when one's rights are squelched by the hands of an arbitrary external force, one will attempt to buck that very system. So I'm setting us up to do Kate Chopin's The Awakening. And I always tell my students that the first premise is a promise. And if we promise here, if we keep the promise, we got to talk about how androcentric versus gynocentric societies create this sense of lacking for women within those societies. And then I have to draw my sources, like my textual support, in terms of that concept to sustain the line of reasoning. So we got to keep in mind a couple of things. The promise of the first premise must be kept, and we got to crank the specificity. So the second premise might look like this. In the early chapters, Chopin juxtaposes a caged bird to the confined and sheltered life of Edna. Throughout the novella, Edna tries to give voice to the calling of her feminist desires. So it is less than ironic that the birds call out, allez-vous-en, saprasti, a language that Edna has come to learn. Translated as, go away, for God's sake. The protagonist is being asked to heed the call of her inevitable flight, right? So this gets into some of the metaphoric values of the text that focus on that lack brought upon by a man-dominated society. So this ties really well to the first premise. We also talked about spiritual lack, so I'm going to mention that right down next. Religion, a male construct, is also drawn into question. For inexplicable reasons, while attending a service, Edna feels an impending sense of suffocating lack and is forced to flee. So you always got to stay anchored in the prompt. I'm on a slide here, so I'm going to go on to the next, still in the second premise. This is just yet another scene in which Chopin's protagonist is being prompted to flee from the cult of domesticity. To further this idea, the author has her lead character filling this sense of lack with men, but quite ironically, man is what needs to go to the wayside for Edna to fully actualize her true self. We're not done yet because we got to get back to that concept of lack and lacking and bring it full circle back to the prompt and the thesis. And conclusions usually take about 2 sentences. So look what this student did here. The dictates of her patriarchal setting is what creates Edna's emptiness and state of lack. Fleeing from all things male-centric is the only solution to fill the void. So that takes care of the first body paragraph, and you can see there the students doing everything that they were doing in the introductory paragraph in terms of vocab, sentence constructs. The line of reasoning is super locked in on this one. And that's something that the frame or the heuristic can help students do. Sustain really, really cogent lines from top to bottom. So the question becomes, what do I do next? And it's simple. You just bust out another syllogism. Let me show you the first premise just to get the wheels rolling on this. And then we can kind of verbally talk through where the rest of it would go in the second premise. Edna's sense of lacking does not resolve itself until the culminating scene of the novella. So therefore, if we keep the promise of the first premise, we have to talk about that end scene here. In many ways, her transformation draws parallels to the death and resurrection of Christ. So Edna as Christ is what we need to get to in the second premise. As such, something dies, patriarchy, and something is reborn, the voice of femininity. Right? So very clearly articulated first premise here, and you can see that there's no plot summary, there's no plot analysis going on in those opening 3 lines. So what the student's going to do is talk about that end scene where she dies and draw the corollaries to the life of Jesus. So Edna equals Jesus. There's a juxtaposition there. So we got to also wrap the essay up and throw a conclusion on it. And I do have a couple of stems that my students use early in the year. And come exam time, if they're really pinched and rushing against the clock, these work well. They're not the most beautiful and eloquent, but they work. Ultimately, I tell students that the conclusion paragraph is kind of like the grand finale of a fireworks display. So they want to say something all encapsulating, all encompassing. So beginning that conclusion paragraph with stems like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, works well. And they can do this in 3 to 4 sentences, which again is perfect for a timed exam. And let's harken back to this. If students are practicing all year long the inverted thesis and the syllogistic method, come exam time, they can rip through these essays super fast. So for my students, time is not really a factor. They can do this with ease because we practice it so much. So here's an example of a conclusion. You can see the word lack is highlighted in yellow there. You got to throw it full circle back to the prompt in the thesis. As is often the case, holes beg to be filled with something substantive. Whether that absence be of a spiritual or personal design, many a character in literature has taken the necessary steps to close those gaping lacks. By the novel's conclusion, Edna is no exception. And that's the whole essay, my friends, from top to bottom. Intro, bodies, conclusion, 4 paragraphs. So note that I'm teamed up with Applied Practice. I do a lot of webinars and seminars and professional development with them. And this summer, we got a really cool one. We're going to take a look at the ampersand composition of AP language and AP literature. So if you want to shore up the basics around how you teach composition for AP Lit and AP Lang, we have summer PD sessions. You can drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com to get more information. And Applied Practice at this very moment is updating their website with information and price and times. And you can go to www.appliedpractice.com. So in this PD session, we're going to take 5 weeks, so 5 90-minute sessions, and go over my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy, and unpack thoroughly how the heuristics and frames can be transposed across all 3 FRQs. So I've taught AP Literature and AP Lang for 2+ decades, written a textbook about it. So good resource if you want to augment your game as far as composition goes. So I'll keep more of these coming in the days and weeks and months ahead. I have basically student exemplars from the 2015 exam all the way to the present for all 3 FRQs, Lang and Lit. And I will post those in the YouTube channel as I record them. Take care for now.